Hey everybody. 40 years ago, almost to the day of my recording this podcast, the 37th President of the United States, Richard Nixon, resigned from office under the threat of impeachment by Congress. Now here was a major American political figure that was controversial, to say the least. It seemed for quite some time that his administration would be remembered for nothing other than the Watergate scandal. But as it turns out, there were a number of things that he and his administration got right. He established the Environmental Protection Agency, for instance, signed the Clean Air Act into law, launched initiatives to fight cancer and illegal drugs, enforced desegregation of Southern schools, and introduced legislation to reform health care and welfare. He initiated détente with the Soviet Union, leading to the SALT I and Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and eventually he ended the Vietnam War through the Paris Peace Accords, although not without significant social upheaval. But one of the most important things that Nixon did was to open diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China in 1972. The significance of that event is something we're still feeling today. This was a stunning event. I mean, think about it. Here's the standard bearer of the Republican Party, a member of the House Un-American Activities Committee, a staunch anti-communist who once famously had a loud quarrel with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet-Russian premier. Seemingly throwing away all of this personal and international history and flying to Peking to meet with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. This was an extraordinary turn of events, a moment of true political and philosophical contrast from a man who seemed never really open to engaging in dialogue with anyone who disagreed with him. Contrast. That striking juxtaposition of stalwart anti-communist and the opening of a dialogue with China is one of the things that struck stage director Peter Sellers when he started to look at this historic event as the basis for an opera. He soon engaged composer John Adams in conversation about the piece, along with poet Alice Goodman, and together they collaborated in the creation of one of the 20th century's great stage pieces, Nixon in China. The concept of contrast underscores everything about this opera. We see it in the meeting of East and West, the relative discomfort of the modern Americans in their suits and ties with the drably uniformed Chinese, or the total disorientation they must have felt at Madame Mao's ballet performance of The Red Detachment of Women, so wonderfully portrayed in the opera. And what about the contrast between Nixon and his wife, Pat? The pragmatic, prickly, worldly politician with the teacher, the dreamer, the sensitive hostess. When you think about it, this little bit of contemporary history, along with events like the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the U.S. landing on the moon, the dropping of the atomic bombs in Japan, or 9/11, they're all ripe for theatrical interpretation and give us something relevant to encounter as an audience. That's because we've all been touched by those events, even if indirectly. The thing that interests me most about the opera, about any opera really, is the music. John Adams is often identified as a minimalist, but I think there's so much more to his music than just that. He uses minimalist techniques, certainly, things like repetition, chordal arpeggios, driving rhythms. But there is so much more to his music. There's great lyricism in the vocal lines, for instance, and the impulsive character of American jazz. Something that really attracts my ear is the kaleidoscopic treatment of the orchestra. There's always something to attract the ear. The colors of the instruments changing, sometimes gradual, sometimes suddenly, making up a kind of aural feast. Here, for instance, is the opening of the opera, the prelude to Act I. It's a simple scale passage that begins in the string section of the orchestra, but ever so slowly you realize that there are other elements overlaying those original scales. Little comments appear from the winds, short driving rhythmic figures that decorate the scales. Then if you listen very carefully, a hidden scale appears moving at a completely different pace from the original scale. Trumpets enter with another rhythmic tattoo. Then finally the chorus enters with the words, "Soldiers of heaven hold the sky, the morning breaks and shadows fly." This is a hypnotic beginning to the opera, drawing us in through an almost meditative technique, an Eastern technique, if you will, opening a gateway to this fascinating story. Well, what a wonderful way to open an opera. This is just the beginning of a series of podcasts on Nixon in China. The most important thing I want to leave you with is this: don't be afraid of it. Meet it head on. Embrace it. Let it take you on a journey. It's a journey you'll be glad you took. I'll see you at the opera.
The people